Hi, everyone. Welcome to our second webinar. We are here with Gloria Medina, and Gloria is an ecologist and volunteer coordinator for the Fairfax County Park Authority Invasive Management Area Program. A key component of her position involves volunteer management of the IMA program's long-term volunteers or site leaders. She works with site leaders to train them on how to identify and manage the invasive plants in the parks, lead groups of volunteers for public work days, and plant native species beneficial to our local ecosystem and wildlife. She'll do some supplemental herbicide spray work done by professional contractors, as well as attend or participate in education and outreach events. So we're here to welcome Gloria.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me and your interest in invasive removal. So like Heidi said, I'm an ecologist with the Fairfax County Park Authority, and I work exclusively with volunteers that remove invasive plants from the parks. And so today we're going to talk about invasive vines in the parks, or even in your own backyards. So go ahead and start. Okay, so welcome to my presentation on invasive vines and their management. So just to talk about the volunteer program that Heidi mentioned earlier, it's the Invasive Management Area Program, and it is a volunteer-based community-based volunteer program where someone like Heidi, who's one of our site leaders, will adopt a park, and she'll focus on removing the invasive plants, and she'll also work with members of the public, like students or other community members that want to help out in that park. And we have about 60 active IMA sites throughout the county, and our focus is tree preservation and habitat restoration through the removal of these invasive plants. And here are just a couple before and after pictures of what some of our volunteers have done. And aside from the public work days that the site leaders host, they also work with Eagle Scouts. And so these are 2 Eagle Scout projects. And at the top, you can see there is a patch of multiflora rose that was removed. And at the bottom, it looks like that was still grass. And there was garlic mustard, and I think a variety of invasive plants. And so they cleared those. And then afterwards, I don't have a picture, but they did do plantings. So we'll go over just what exactly is an invasive species and common terms I'll use many times throughout this presentation. How to identify the invasives and how to tell them apart from native lookalikes, and then how to manage those invasive plants. So we have native species, introduced species, and we have invasive species. And a native species is just an organism that is naturally occurring to this area without human intervention. And that just means specifically for this area of plants that were present before European settlement. So plants that naturally evolved and migrated here. And then an introduced species is the opposite, something that was brought over from another continent or even ecosystem, say from the West Coast or Florida. Those plants aren't necessarily native to the mid-Atlantic. And then we have invasive species, and those are species whose introduction caused harm to the environment. And we get common questions that we get about these terms are there any introduced species that aren't invasive? Like, are all non-native plants invasive? And the answer is no. They have to have a certain combination of characteristics to make them qualify as an invasive species. And then are any native plants known as invasive? And that is a yes. For example, greenbrier or the native grape vine, and also poison ivy, they're all native plants, but they can be aggressive and take over an area, especially if it's a forest edge growing in full sun. Those can grow pretty aggressively. So what are those common characteristics that makes an introduced plant or even a native plant, well, no, just an introduced plant invasive? So they grow rapidly, much faster than our native plants. And in this picture is an example of kudzu. And kudzu is known to grow up to 10 feet a day or a foot a day in the summertime, which is still very fast compared to our native plants. And another characteristic most of these invasive species have is that they not only produce seeds, but they also spread through rhizomes or runners. So they spread vegetatively by their roots, and they can also disperse seeds and spread that way. And many of these are prolific seed producers. So one fruit or one berry can have hundreds, if not thousands of seeds. And if you don't remove those invasive plants before the seeds are, before they ripen and drop, that plant is just adding to the seed bank in the soil and adding to the number of years that you'll have to go back and remove those invasive plants. Many of these have a longer growing season, which you can actually see now. Many of the plants that still have their green leaves on right now in the early winter are invasive plants. Honeysuckles and barberry and multiflora rose, they all still have their green leaves. And they might lose them over the winter, but in the springtime, early spring, they'll be the first to re-leaf out again. So they have that longer growing period and advantage over the native plants. Most of these adapt really easily to disturbance, such as construction or flooding events from storms. They have a broad tolerance range for environmental conditions. Stillgrass, for example, you can find it growing in the shade in the understory of a forest. You can also find it thriving in a full sun meadow. And then you can find it along a stream and floodplain. And you can also find it growing upland in a dry area. And then, of course, because they're not native to this region, they didn't evolve here, they don't have any natural predators. So deer won't browse on most of these plants. Unfortunately, birds will eat the berries and then disperse the seeds. So they're not helping to control the plant, but they're helping to spread them. And so what are the impacts of these invasive species? Because they grow so much faster than our native plants, they can often create these monocultures, like in these two pictures. We have porcelain berry in the top, just completely growing over the tops of these trees and killing them. And we also have pachysandra, which is a ground cover, and it grows so densely, it displaces the natives. It doesn't allow other natives to grow up from the seed bank, and also doesn't allow seedlings to get any sunlight and mature. And by creating these monocultures or these patches of just one species, they're lowering not just the plant biodiversity, but also the wildlife and pollinator diversity that depend on our native plants. And then these really aggressive invasive plants can also impact our recreational activities, such as if you've ever been to Giles Run Meadow golf course in Lorton, it looks pretty similar to the picture in the top. The golf course aisles are right along the forest edge, and as the invasive vines and some shrubs are crowding the aisles, it's affecting their ability to play. And then we also have aquatic invasive species, and those impact boating and fishing activities. Okay, I can't see the comments, but maybe Margaret or Heidi can read out the comments to me. I wanted to see if a few people in the audience could identify some of these species.
Okay. Put it in the chat if you know any of these species. English ivy, English ivy, English ivy. Porcelain berry, mile a minute. Mile a minute. Kudzu. We're out of ideas. Oriental bittersweet.
Oriental bittersweet, yep. And then I think the last three that weren't mentioned next to the kudzu in the top right is wisteria. Right under that is winter creeper. And next to the bittersweet is Japanese honeysuckle. Good.
And it says,
Yes,
one
we
says,
did.
please point out which is which.
Oh, sure. Can you see my arrow?
Yeah.
Okay, so this first one is English ivy. The second one is porcelain berry. This one is kudzu. This is the wisteria vine. This one's mile-a-minute. This is oriental bittersweet, Japanese honeysuckle, and winter creeper. So English ivy. It's an evergreen perennial vine. It starts out as a ground cover growing, creeping along spreading by its roots on the ground. And then once it reaches a structure like a tree or a fence, it'll start growing upwards on that structure. And the interesting thing about English ivy is that once it's growing vertically, the leaves will mature. And in the top picture, these are the juvenile leaves, and they have 3 to 5 lobes. But once the leaves mature, they look a little bit different. So they're just a whole leaf and no lobes. The veins, I guess, stand out a little bit less. And then once they do mature, growing up vertically, that's when they produce berries and flowers. So if it's just growing on the ground, you don't have to worry about it spreading by seeds, but you still want to get those roots out. Otherwise, it'll continue spreading if there's nothing blocking it, like a sidewalk or a road. It does produce berries which the birds eat and spread. They have these small clusters of greenish to yellow flowers, and then the black blueberries, the ends of the plants. So what are some native lookalikes? On the left, we have the English ivy, which is an evergreen. Let me just move this. It has the 3 to, you can see about 3 lobes on this leaf and 5 on this leaf. They have dark green, kind of waxy, tougher leaves in the native lookalikes. And again, those dark berries. Then we have Virginia creeper and poison ivy, which are both native vines, and they do grow up on trees. Unlike English ivy, however, they don't completely cover the trunk as much, and each one has multiple leaflets per leaf. So English ivy this is 1 leaf, and Virginia creeper has 3 to 5 leaflets per leaf, and poison ivy has 3 leaflets per leaf. And both Virginia creeper and poison ivy can have like a dark red color when the leaves are young. But right now, now's the perfect time to work on English ivy because Virginia creeper and poison ivy both lose their leaves, and English ivy maintains them throughout the year. Winter creeper is another evergreen perennial vine that grows as a ground cover, and then once it reaches a structure, it starts growing vertically. And just like English ivy, it doesn't produce berries until it's growing vertically. Let's see, unlike English ivy, winter creeper has opposite leaves with small, finely toothed serrations on the leaf edges and small orange to red berries. And English ivy will grow just along the trunk of a tree, but winter creeper will also grow along the trunk. And then once it gets higher up, it throws out these branches to the sides, which you can see in the top right corner in a picture. And I think there's another example. So it can really throw out those branches. And if you can see, the top leaves of the tree are yellow, and then everything else, that's all winter creeper. So it's growing all along the trunk and then at the base on the ground. Lookalike for winter creeper is Parchaberry, which is a native evergreen vine, and they look pretty similar. They both have opposite leaves, but the best way to tell them apart is if you look closely at the leaves. Winter creeper has those fine serrations along the edges, whereas Parchaberry does not have any serrations, and the size of the leaves are also a good way to distinguish them. Winter creeper's leaves are about 1 to 2.5 inches, whereas the Parchaberry leaves are only about 1/2 inch across. The flowers, if you happen to come across it when they're flowering, is also a good indication. Whereas winter creeper has 4 to 5 petals per leaf, Parchaberry has a clear white color to the leaves and also pubescence on the petals of the leaves of the flowers. Also, Parchaberry doesn't grow as aggressively as winter creeper, so you won't see it taking over yards of ground cover. And what else? I think that's about it for the differences between those two. So now we have Asiatic bittersweet, which is a woody twining vine. And this one will wrap around trees and branches, and over time they will girdle the trees and kill them. But because the leaves are so densely, they can grow very densely, they also shade out trees if it gets over to the top. And these are alternate, also finely toothed leaves, and they have a round shape and taper to a point. They have clusters of small greenish to white flowers at the leaf axils. So you'll find them all along the leaf stem, the stems of the vines, right where the leaves meet the stem. And then they have red berries with a yellow capsule or shell around the berries. And just an interesting note about bittersweet, the roots, if you can pull the juvenile vines out of the ground, the roots are orange. I'm not sure if the native bittersweet has orange vines. So here we have the Asiatic non-native bittersweet on the left and the American bittersweet on the right, which is much less common in this area. And honestly, the best way to tell them apart is when they're flowering. The flowers, again, of the Asiatic bittersweet grow along the stem, along the axils of the leaves. And the native bittersweet, it only grows at the terminal end, so at the very end of each vine. The berries can also help tell apart, although the flowers are a much better way to tell them apart. But the berries of the bittersweet, of the Asiatic bittersweet, has that yellow shell around the berries, whereas the native one has more of an orange to red shell. Now is a great time to go out and find bittersweet because all these berries are still hanging out, and that yellow really makes it pop. Milo-minute is an annual plant, so it's not as pulling up the vines out of the ground isn't effective for eradication in the wintertime, but it is another vine, and it can grow over the tops of shrubs or small trees. And if it gets if it touches low-hanging branches of a mature tree, it can climb up. And it has these triangular, almost equilateral leaves and these circular leaves that the stem grows through. And then these multicolored white to yellow to blue berries. And a native lookalike is the arrowleaf Paratum. And they look pretty much alike. They have green leaves and the reddish stems, but the native Paratum really has a longer, narrow arrow-shaped leaves, whereas the Milo-minute has those triangular leaves. And even if you can't deplete the seed bank in the wintertime because the plant is dead and it's just gonna re-sprout from the seeds, you can still remove that, all these dead vines, you can remove them from the shrubs and the trees that are underneath. And then next year, when the seed bank starts growing again, you can spot those seedlings faster. This is Porcelain Berry, and it looks similar to the native grape, but it is a deciduous woody vine. And it would be nice if every Porcelain Berry leaf had these very deep indentations, but they don't. Unfortunately, on the same vine, you can find those deep lobes and also a whole leaf that looks just like a native vine. But the Porcelain Berry has this smooth bark. And if you were to cut a woody branch of the Porcelain Berry, not a young stem, but a woody one, you'll see that the center, the pith, is white. And here we have the native grape. And so the porcelain berry has that smooth bark, whereas the native grapes have this flaky bark that peels. And aside from that, that's a good indicator in the wintertime when there aren't any leaves or fruits present. But throughout the rest of the year, when you catch it and it has berries or fruits present, the best way to tell them apart is by looking at those, because the porcelain berry flowers and fruits both grow upwards towards the sky, whereas the native grape, the flowers and the berries hang down. But now in the winter, now that it's lost its leaves and berries, this difference in bark texture is the best indicator. Also, if you're unsure and you find a smaller woody stem, I wouldn't risk cutting a larger stem. But if you cut the stem and the center is white, it's the non-native porcelain berry. But if you cut the center of the native grape, it's going to be a brown pith. And then Japanese honeysuckle is another woody vine. This is a trailing vine and a twining vine, so it'll grow as a ground cover. It'll grow over the tops of small shrubs or tree seedlings, and it'll also grow up trees and twist around them like bittersweet does. This one has opposite ovate to lobe leaves, so you can kind of see in this top right picture on the same stem, there's two leaves that have these deep lobes, and they can go even deeper than that, looking almost like a mini white oak leaf. But then some of them can also just be a whole leaf with no lobes, which you can see on this picture at the bottom. And it also has the yellow to white, really fragrant flowers. And now in the winter, you want to look for that reddish brown stems, especially if they're twining around anything and they're growing in mass like this. It's most likely the Japanese honeysuckle. And because it is a semi-evergreen vine, you can still find some of the leaves persisting throughout the winter. And now this is a quick 1-minute video by Patricia Greenberg, who's the program manager for the Invasive Management Area program. And she's just demonstrating and talking about how to remove specifically porcelain berry vine. But for all invasive vines, you basically use the same technique.
So what we have here is porcelain berry vine covering over a sweet gum tree, and the sweet gum tree is completely inundated by the porcelain berry as well as multiple rows. And so what we want to do to protect this tree or give it a chance is to remove the vines by creating a window. You want to cut low, cut high, remove all the debris from the middle, leave the stuff that's above your head because you don't want those vines falling on you. And then you want to dig out those roots as much as you can, because if you're not digging those roots out, this stuff will just come right back. There's already a seed bank in the ground from the seeds of the porcelain berry. So it's really important that you are digging out the roots and coming back to it year after year. One way to tell for sure that you have porcelain berry instead of grape is by cutting a woody piece and looking at the heart or the pith and making sure that it's white. The grape has a brown pith.
Okay, so just to go over what she said. And again, the removal technique and management technique for most invasive vines is essentially the same. So she mentioned creating a window, and as you can see in this top picture, that's what that would look like. You want to cut towards the bottom of the tree, and then higher, you can cut up a few feet or as high as you can reach, and just pry those roots off the tree if it's something like winter creeper or English ivy, where those roots really attach themselves to the tree. You want to gently pry them off and try not to get any of the actual tree bark pulled off. Otherwise, you can expose the tree to pathogens. But once you've made those cuts around the entire circumference of the trunk, you just pull that bark down, create that window, and then you can also create kind of like a donut around the base of the tree. And the reason you want to do that is, first, by creating that window, you're disconnecting the vines that are up on the tree from the resources, so they will die eventually. And by creating the ring around the base of the tree, you're be able to see as those vines are creeping back towards the tree. If you can't get to all of it at once. And if you have an infestation like this, where it's on the tree and it's covering the ground also, you want to focus on creating that window first, cutting off that connection from the resources and killing the vines. And then you can focus on pulling the roots out of the ground. And then she mentioned not pulling the vines from the tree. That's really important just for two reasons. First, you don't want to hurt yourself by bringing down any branches on yourself. And you also don't want to accidentally break any of the branches from the tree, which the goal is to save the tree. And then a safe bet for removal is to just bag everything that you removed, all the invasive plants. But depending on the species, there are different ways to handle the debris. If it's something like English ivy or Japanese honeysuckle or winter creeper, those will reroot if you leave them touching bare ground or soil. But if you put it on top of a piece of cardboard or on the pavement or on your driveway, it won't be able to reroot and it'll just die, and then you can dispose of it later. Otherwise, the other invasive vines that don't spread vegetatively, you can just bag it in or just make a pile in your yard and leave it there to dry and die. And then she also mentioned going back to monitor those roots. If you can't, once you've gotten the vines from the trees, you want to focus on getting the roots out of the ground. And for many of these species, like English ivy, or for English ivy specifically, it doesn't have really deep roots. So you can easily pull them out of the ground, and you can even roll it and just roll it like a blanket and get most of it off. But you'll still have to come back to deplete that seed bank in the soil. For others like wisteria or porcelain berry or bittersweet, those roots can grow really thickly and deep in the soil. So you want to gently dig those out and pull them out. And with any invasive species, it doesn't matter if you've gotten the majority of the root out or if you've bagged the plants before it's gone to seed, you're always going to want to come back and monitor that space because there are going to be root fragments that were left behind, and there's definitely a seed bank in the soil. So you'll have to come back for a few years until you've really depleted that area of the invasive plants. So here are some tools that our volunteers use for removing invasive plants. They use just their hands for pulling the plants depending on how easily they uproot. This weed wrench on the right can be used once you've exposed a large root of, say, porcelain berry or bittersweet. You can clamp this opening around the root and just leverage it back, and it'll help you ease it out of the ground. And then just saws and clippers to help you cut the vines around the tree. And if I didn't mention it before, when you're creating that window with English ivy, you can use a screwdriver to help pry it off the bark. And then these are just some pictures of the volunteers bagging the invasive that they removed. And this is a picture of one of our volunteers who pulled out a long vine of honeysuckle. And then here are some more before and after pictures. Here we have porcelain berry growing on the trees and myrlemina growing right around the base. And as you can see, they cut the vines and they uprooted all the myrlemina, or they pulled out all the myrlemina. And then they left the dead leaves, the dead vines up on the tree. And it is unsightly, and you might get complaints about why are you leaving the dead vines on the trees, but you just want to explain that it's for safety purposes. They will die and fall off on their own eventually. And then here we have another site that was covered in porcelain berry, myrlemina, stillgrass. It had a variety of different invasive plants. And they were able to clear it in a day. We had a large group. And then we did a planting afterwards. And you can see these tree tubes. But this is a cautionary tale about monitoring your site and going back to get those resprouts. The volunteer had to retire and the site was left unmonitored for about a year or two, and these vines just came back and took over the site again. So it looks like this again. So you really want to, whatever invasive species you're working with, you want to go back to it year after year and until you've depleted that seed bank. And here's two pictures of myrlemina before and after picture once it was removed. Under all that mile-a-minute, you can see there were some native grasses growing in these. And then this is just a really great resource for learning about invasive plants. This one covers vines, but it also covers grasses and trees and shrubs and some aquatic species. And you can find this online. You can order it online, or you can also just download the PDF for free. And then in the picture, you can see some volunteers that they did a top and low cut of this wisteria vine that was growing around a tree, and then they gently pried it off. So that's the end. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Great. So we have a few questions, and if anyone has others, please put them in the chat. We're starting with the mile-a-minute. 2 questions. What time of year is a good time to remove mile-a-minute? And does the Parchaberry sagittaria, the other one, also have the little thorns? I don't know, thorns isn't quite the right word, is it?
They're a little thorny. And yes, they do. They're both covered in those thorns. That's why I think they're both called, a common name for each one is tear thumb. Mile-a-minute is devil's tear thumb. But yes, they do both have those thorns. And a good time to remove mile-a-minute would be about mid-July in the summertime before the berries ripen. Once they're green, once you see those green berries going, you want to pull them and bag them.
Okay, great. Right, so then turning to porcelain berry versus grape, 2 questions here. Don't the porcelain berry vines wind around the tree while the grapevines grow away from the tree until way up at the top? That's the first question. And the second one was, are we saying that grapevines are okay to grow up a tree?
Yes, grapevines are okay to grow up a tree. They did evolve together, and they don't, if it's growing in a shadier area, they won't grow as aggressively. But like I said, if it's growing on the edge of the forest and it's in full sun, it will grow very aggressively. And depending on what your management goals are, if you want to save those trees, cutting some of the native grapevines would be okay. It's not endangered. It will grow back, and you'll expose the tree to some more sunlight. And then the other question was about porcelain berry twining. I think it can twine. The tendrils of the vines will definitely wrap around branches the way grape does, but it also can just grow. If it reaches a low-hanging branch, it'll just grow straight up like grape. So oftentimes the volunteers can confuse what porcelain berry vine and grape vines look like, because it doesn't always wrap around trees. Sometimes it's just hanging and kind of swinging low like a grapevine. So you want to look for that smooth bark.
All right, well then another question, a corollary question is, I've heard that porcelain berry has differently spaced tendrils than the grape. True?
I don't know about that specific about the tendrils. I'm not sure.
We actually researched that when we made our thing that's on our webpage. Only one of the native grape species has tendrils at 3 nodes in a row or more. Porcelain berry will have tendrils at 3 or more in a row. So if in no place can you see more than 3, then it would be a native grape. But if you see 3 or more, it could be fox grape, but you'd have to wait until you can see the leaves, because the leaves of fox grape are fuzzy orange.
Okay, that's good to know.
Then another question, 2 more questions. Do grapevines cover trees?
They can, yeah, if they're growing really aggressively in the sun, they can grow over the tops of trees.
And then greenbrier and poison ivy are both natives and host plants. If we use the aggressive natives, there should be less of a vacuum to be filled by invasives. Comment there.
That's a good theory. I think the porcelain berry would use the poison ivy and the greenbrier, especially, to just grow over top of that.
Yeah, I don't. This hope that our native plants may somehow outcompete the invasives doesn't seem to be working out too well, unfortunately. Okay.